Welcome back. Now, the G20 Summit kicked off today, bringing together business leaders from G20 member countries ahead of the G20 leaders meeting. On the sidelines, I caught up with Trevor Manuel, who's the chair of Old Mutual, as well as the G20 Africa expert panel, for a look into how the B20 went about aligning policy recommendations in a fragmented landscape. Here's that conversation.
Look, the big challenge, I think, is that unless leaders recognize a problem and call it out, you can't deal with it. The problem right now is that the world that we've known is being demolished. And it's being demolished in a crude way. I'm not even sure that it's policy-driven or just driven by women caprice. And if you look at the present and compare it to the period of 80 years ago, before the guns fell silent in World War II, world leaders had met in two important gatherings. One was at San Francisco and said the League of Nations hasn't played its role. Let's establish a United Nations. And the UN was then set up to try and prevent war. And part of it was particular mechanisms, including the Security Council. The other organizations that were set up were the World Bank and the IMF, one focusing on reconstruction development and the other on balance of payments constraints. And these organizations were set up before the guns fell silent. But you had leaders who said we need a different world on the other side of this war. A world that will be more collaborative. And for the past 80 years, there's been work done towards this. Not always in agreement. And there have been times when there was accelerated change. So with the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there was a lot more change. There were a lot more nation states created. The Soviet Union fell apart, more nation states. And the size of the World Bank and the IMF, as well as the United Nations, grew very rapidly. And then the systems to try and manage all of this. The laggard was a single organization to handle trade, and wasn't until the beginning of this millennium, 2000, when the WTO was established. Now, what has happened is that however the world looked at it, Reagan and Thatcher established a difference. They established something called neoliberalism, more focused on the private sector. And that became very much the order of the day. The biggest beneficiaries of neoliberalism were actually the Asian countries, China in particular. And so you saw manufacturing, for instance, move out of the West into the East. And this allowed China especially to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And as they did that, they were able to spread the opportunity to other Asian countries. So this is the world that we find now. And in the face of this, you have the Trump administration seeking to destroy all of this. We don't even know if that destruction is complete, and we don't know what the world on the other side of this looks like. But there will have to be new alignments of countries.
Are you concerned about that, considering the shifts in policy, the shifts when it comes to multilateral platforms, right? Where it seems like we have this wave of protectionism and the global north seems to be looking inwards.
They're looking inward Indeed, but I'm not quite sure what they're seeing when they look in. Because part of what's happening is that they also cut themselves off from opportunities that have developed. And there's also a battle against science, which has evolved quite extensively. And if you look at climate science as an example, this past week has been terrible in Johannesburg. It's been freezing because climate change is, it's not some future event. You can look at the changes in climate everywhere. And so pretending that climate change is not a reality is indeed a foolish enterprise. So to suggest that we need more fossil fuels, drill baby drill, is flying in the face of science. Surely we should invite our scientists to invest the intellectual resources in finding solutions that are more inclusive, that will take renewable energy at lower cost to more people. Surely that makes for a better world. And that'll have consequences for all kinds of things. It'll have consequences for the built environment. It'll have consequences for manufacturing. It'll have consequences for transportation, for the interaction between people. And leaders must always rise above the fray of the immediate and be seen to look into the future. As I'm saying, that those imperfect leaders who were dominant in World War II took the plunge into the future and created institutions for the future.
So we talk about, drill baby drill. We also see NATO nations sort of upping their defense spending budgets. And I ask myself, what does that mean for war? What does that mean for sentiment when it comes to war, when we're trying to push more peaceful efforts? We can't deny that there's also some conflict here in the country. But what I'm really concerned about when it comes to the G20, we've seen a really cohesive handover from India to Brazil to South Africa. And I wonder whether it will be cohesive, whether there will be harmonization when we hand over to the US an empty seat per se, and whether the efforts that were pushed for the global South will still be important to a country like the US.
I think the environment that policymakers need is certainty and predictability. Granted, there are always a series of unforeseen issues that arise, but to the extent possible, predictability, certainty, foreseeability ought to be what shapes policy going forward. And you have a situation where initially there was ambivalence about whether the US would participate.
Yeah.
Then the president announced that whilst he wouldn't attend, Vice President J.D. Vance would. Over the period, certainly in the finance track, the Treasury and the Fed participated in the working groups. Suddenly, in an unprovoked way, the president announces nobody can attend. No US official can attend the G20. And it's not just the G20. In fact, there were some people who were meant to be on the panels of the B20 who didn't want to be seen to be offending the president, and so they withdrew as well. You can't take decisions on the basis of what you felt like this morning. There has to be a requirement to support what you do with empirical evidence. And there's nothing to support this. And you can't just shout people down who disagree with you. And it bodes ill for the future, not just of the G20, but for all of multilateralism. Now, the G20 has grown too far, too fast, too broad in its remit. But there is a place for countries that are deemed to be systemically significant to get together and talk and reach agreement on issues. But I don't know, without the Troika, I mean, we can continue to talk to Brazil. We can even talk to the UK that'll take over from the US. But the absence of the US presents all of the work. It's not South Africa. It's all of the work, because virtually all of the work, especially of the Sherpas and the finance teams, or streams as it's called, all of that is continuous, so that you can track what happened in Indonesia, through India, through Brazil, into South Africa. It would be good if you can build that continuity. And then each of the presidencies has had standalone reports, like our standalone report on on Africa, but it's in the major streams of work that the uncertainty has now been introduced.
Does the uncertainty then create a sort of risk when it comes to crowding in funding, particularly for infrastructure here at home and the continent at large?
Look, the curiosity about your question is that African funding, infrastructure funding, does not depend on the G20. It would help if there were more of a voice that dealt with the cost of capital, that dealt with issues such as the inequality driven by the behavior of ratings agencies, the way in which we deal with the World Bank and IMF on lending, providing a different voice to ensure greater transparency, especially of Chinese lending and so on. It would help, but it's not entirely or narrowly dependent. I think that the greater benefit of the G20 is the ability for a group of countries to sit together and persuade each other of how to amend things. And some of what we're dealing with now in the world, some of the corrections that were introduced, especially to global banking regulations and so on, arose from G20 work, and you don't want all of that to end.
That was Trevor Manuel, chair of Old Mutual and the G20 Africa Expert Panel.